I want to welcome you all to first of all, to All Souls. We're a spiritual community center open to all. And we are delighted to be collaborating with Shelburne Museum and Shelburne Farms and the Pierson Library to be in our 6th year of putting on a community conversation series. And you were all so brave because we've had so much snow in March that we had to cancel 2 and postpone 2. So we're so grateful that you have found the date and made the time and are here. And we're also grateful to RETN, who's our media sponsor, because they are taking this rich conversation as well as the 6 years of history of conversations out to a broader audience through Channel 16. So thank you to RETN. And the Vermont Humanities Council, this is the first year they've sponsored this series. So we are very grateful to them for their support, enabling us to have broader outreach this year. And I'd like to just turn it over to my friend and colleague, Fran Stoddard, who is, I always call Fran, I call you Fran, the sort of a combination between Terry Gross and Krista Tippett. But you're right here in Shelburne, so how lucky are we?
That works for me.
Yeah, you'll
I'm
take
good
it.
with that. I'm down with that. Thank you so much. Well, and again, thank you all for coming and being part of this, really a studio audience. It is great to have RETN here who will share this with the rest of the community. So there's a committee of folks from Shelburne Museum, Shelburne Farms, the Shelburne Library, and All Souls who talk about what are we going to do for the March series. And this year it was very rapidly became relationship across difference, because there's so many divides, and conflict certainly is all around us. It's really part of the human condition, but there's just been something about this year that has made us all aware about how divided this country is. It's kind of something we haven't seen in decades. And so there's a renewed call for relationship across difference, about bridging these divides. And as I was talking to these 2 fabulous guests I have today, we realized that the rivers are wide, the waters are roiling, the bridges are damaged and sometimes even dangerous, but there are many ways that we can connect and help connect people. So this is the last of this year's 3-part series on relationship across difference, where we'll explore the human connection, looking at how we connect, how we reconnect, resolve differences and disagreements when we're in conflict. So to help us do this, we have Lisa Bedinger. She is the coordinator of the South Burlington Community Justice Center, which provides opportunities to address crime and conflict as a community. That's at the local level, and it's through a restorative justice approach. Lisa has a master's degree in mediation and applied conflict studies and over 20 years of experience in teaching classes, support groups, and workshops on identity, culture, and their impact upon relationships and opportunity. This informs her passion for that aim to repair relationships across lines of difference, and she has extensive experience with designing and facilitating dialogue-based events. Susanne Terry is a mediator, divorce mediator, facilitator, organizational consultant, and trainer working out of Danville, Vermont. I think many of you might know her. She created the mediation program at Woodbury College and served as its director for 8 years. And then she continued to teach in the program as it became a graduate degree granting program through Champlain College. She's a national leader in conflict resolution and has worked throughout the United States as well as Great Britain, Ireland, Belgium, Italy, and Ghana. And she's currently involved in a publication project for Rowan and Littlefield, which I meant to ask her about, and maybe we'll get to that. So how we're going to do this is we're going to dialogue for a little while. I've got a bunch of questions, and then we really want for you to also get involved in this conversation about how we can bridge differences. So where I want to go first with the 2 of you is how have demands for your work changed over this last year? Is there more urgency? Is there a difference in focus, do you think? It feels that people seem very uneasy about all the divides that are showing up. Lisa, do you want to just start with that.
Yeah, and I want to add also that
Please.
the South Burlington Community Justice Center also serves Shelburne, so this is one of the communities that
perfect.
we serve as well. So I wanted to give that context. I want to talk specifically, last year in South Burlington was a hard year. A lot happened. We had a lot of conflict over the mascot and should the name be changed. The budget was defeated twice, the school budget was defeated twice, and there were several events where people did things that were both criminal and painful. And so the community was hurting as a whole. And this time last year is when all of this happened. And so I had some community members come to me and said, you know, we need some help. Our community is struggling. And what we put together was a community conversation or community dialogue process. And because the school district and was part of some of the things that were happening that were painful, we needed to have somebody not involved in the actual conflicts or the issues. So the Community Justice Center joined with faith leaders in South Burlington to convene a conversation with the hope that everyone would feel welcome regardless of their perspective on the issues. It happened very quickly. There was a week where the school was locked down almost every day, and then school was canceled, and this was right before the April vacation. So almost exactly a year ago. And
Because there were threats. I mean,
yes, there were threats of
some
violence, yes. And so we had that week, school vacation week, the next Tuesday, we had the dialogue. So it came together really quickly. And about a little over 100 people came on really short notice, and we had lots of small group conversations to start to get to know each other offline, because the online conversation was very painful and harsh.
Okay. So we'll get to more specifics on that and how that resolved, because I think a lot of people certainly remember that, and there are a lot of details. But again, have demands changed? Do you think are people thinking about about mediation or coming together differently? Susan?
So here's a quirk about the work that both Lisa and I do. We get to participate with people in whatever they're struggling with after it has ramped up, or after people have been clenching their teeth for a long time, and they say, we need to do something. So it's not like you're starting at the point of saying, oh, well, this could be difficult. Let's do this. So what we're seeing now is that things ramp up faster. So things go from 0 to 100 very quickly. And probably because of stresses in the national or world picture, et cetera, partly because our culture gives people permission to dramatize everything and say things that you would not ordinarily say in civil society. So we see that quick flash, and there we are.
Yeah, and I'd say I've seen more change online than I have in person, and the nature of the conversation online, and just people say things online they wouldn't say in person.
Because they can do it anonymously. Or not necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know, just the tone of the conversation is different online. So that was part of what when we got together in person, we talked about that dynamic. And, Yeah.
Yeah. That was going to be a question a little later. We might still get to it, but that does seem to be what's going on there. But before, just to ground everybody in the work that you do. So you're both mediators. What is the goal of mediation as opposed to, we're not in the legal system. Fortunately, I mean, there was some, whether we need to bring the police in or not, but just what is the goals of mediation?
So I'm going to start from a slightly different perspective. You can speak for yourself, but I think of us as conflict workers.
Okay.
Mediation is one way that we deal with conflict. Public dialogue is another way. Circles of understanding is another way. So it's a wide variety of things. They may all have somewhat the same goal, which is where possible to promote understanding, help people to be heard, to find where there are convergences, where there are not convergences, and how you manage those differences. My work is not about how to get people to give up certain things or meet in the middle. It's not about compromise. It's about how people get what they most fundamentally need, if it's possible, and then reach some understanding, again, of how you navigate in a community with people you hopefully care about when there are dramatic differences.
Right. And I appreciate we're dealing a lot with some audio issues here, so people are rushing around trying to resolve those. So thank you for your patience with that.
Do you mind if I add a little to that?
And no, not at all.
Okay.
I've got a question too.
So I was when I think about mediation, I think of a particular process where people hope to come out of that with some agreements. And so there's a core that's similar across what different kinds of processes. Sometimes with dialogue, there is no goal of agreement at all. It's really a goal of, can we have a different kind of conversation than we've ever had before? Can we come out of this with a little more understanding of where each of us are that we didn't have before we walked in the room, and maybe know each other better and have a different relationship? So sometimes the goals are a little different depending on the process.
Right. So you hope hearing takes place right away. Trust might not come until much later.
Yeah, it's possible, yeah.
You talked about convergences. Can you go a little bit deeper with that? So it's not about compromise, but it is about convergences. Can you?
I'll give you an example
Great.
of a design that I did. That's the other thing we do is a lot of design work about how people talk. And I never actually met with this group. I just helped them do it. They were having a lot of challenges with crowds at abortion clinics. And things had really ramped up. It was very, very difficult. And everybody had their concerns. And everybody wanted the right to speak about it or the right to move through and get. So, as you know, this is one of the most difficult issues to deal with. And things had gotten to a point where everybody was getting arrested and they were afraid somebody was going to get hurt. And this was around the time when some people were, there had been a couple of killings around abortion centers. So a group of very wise people said, let's get together and plan a way we can talk about this and see what we can do. Are there any rules we can have about how people demonstrate or whatever? So what we designed was, first of all, it was advertised saying, we understand we will never agree on the fundamental issue. So they walked in knowing that that was not going to be up for grabs. So given those differences, what do we do so that we still have voice but we don't damage our community? And they went through a number of steps in which people talked about why what they were doing was important to them and what they were most worried about. And what they ended up realizing was that the thing they were most worried about was that young kids discovered they were pregnant, about to be a mother or a father. Many of them had gotten thrown out of their homes. And these kids had no place to go, nothing to do, no way to manage it. Abortion was what they were choosing. And what they formed was a coalition to provide housing for a year after a baby was born, parenting classes, education, et cetera, which was done by those two groups.
Wow. So they could come together on that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And we'll start getting into some more details, but just some skill sets that are necessary for you as a practitioner, because I think we'll get to how each of us can be practitioners in this work, even though we aren't professional. But what would you say are some skill sets that maybe even brought you to mediation and this work? Now, what brought you to this work, and what are some of the skill sets necessary? Lisa?
My first thought is that that I think of my job is how do I create a structure, a process that gives people the best shot at having a good experience and a good conversation, and that's more important to what I think about whatever the issue is. And so I prioritize like, how do I set this up well for people in the room?
Susan?
For me, if I was going to isolate one skill that all of us here could focus on and it would make a profound difference, is the ability to actually listen to people. I realize that one of the challenges I have is if somebody who has a very different opinion from me starts talking, I am immediately formulating how I'm going to point out that they're wrong. And so I've got this thing going on in my brain which fills up all of the space and doesn't allow me to be curious about what it is they're really trying to convey. So if you go back to the Seattle thing, if people are just sitting there figuring out how they're going to rebut the other side, they're never going to get to what are people most concerned about, and therefore how can we solve this? Yeah.
How do you help people get to a place where they can actually hear other people? I mean, when there's a clear imbalance of power, when there's, you know, how do you get people to move from that position, to shift, to change a little bit, to let go of that, and actually hear another side? Lisa?
And for me, that's in the design process. So you structure the conversation to assist people toward that goal. For example, you don't put one microphone up in the front of the room and expect that people can hear in that setup. You put people together in smaller groups. You slow down the conversation so that people have time to talk and have time to listen. And you can slow it down by using a talking piece, by helping people like, okay, I don't have to worry about jumping in and interrupting because I know the speaking order, and I don't have to. I don't even have to formulate a response. I can just be present and listen right now. So there's different tools like that.
Right.
Yeah.
They must feel safe enough in that space.
Yeah.
Susan?
So I would answer this two ways, I think. One is I keep asking myself, not is it, what is it that I want to do or not do, it's who do I want to be. So in this moment when this is happening, who is the person that I am? And that's the piece I think that, particularly for folks that come from a faith tradition, or people that come from a home where there were strong values, or where you didn't come from a home where there were strong values and you learned later on that that was important. Those kind of things help ground us. You know, who do I want to be in relationship to this other person? The other thing that I think is a really important tool is we all know how to spout off. We all know how to just say something without thinking. How do we say something that the other person will welcome? I don't mean how do we water down what we believe, but how do we say it in such a way that it touches something in the other person that they go, oh, okay, you feel that way. So I see that experience in divorce. People are often angry or disappointed at one another, and sometimes it feels like their last chance to say something, and often I'll say to them privately, okay, so you got that off your chest. So what is it you would like for him to understand? And how might you say that so he could really understand it? You want to try it out on me? Let's see. Really? You're going to yell? Let's try it again.
Okay, right. Great. So back to South Burlington. It was really a frightening period a year ago. There were, the lockdowns, the budget rejection, social media threats. The students felt unsafe. Parents were terrified. It was really very scary. So you talked about it a little bit, but what did you do and what seemed to work? And how do things feel like they're progressing from that very, very tough place?
So one of the things that I think helped was the faith leaders who were present, there was 9, talked about why this event was important to them, why talking across difference mattered, why creating a space for conversations mattered to them personally. And so they helped set the tone for that this is important and this matters.
So that's how it started, was with these faith leaders that all came together from different faiths.
Yeah, yeah. And then, similar to what Susan said before, I helped set the tone by starting with saying, you know, think about what is the chance that you're going to walk out of this room with your mind changed about anything, and to assume that's true of everybody else, and that's not why we're here. So to take people out of how they usually, the motivations that they usually come to in a conversation, and set those aside. And then talk about other reasons, like I want you to feel heard and understood, and want you to feel like you hear and understand others as well, particularly people you may not know or disagree with, so that you walk out of here with a deeper sense of understanding.
So let's go a little deeper. And Susan, you're also a facilitator of big public conversations about, abortion, sexual harassment, racism. So how do you begin a conversation, say, about race in a state where many people have very little contact on an everyday basis with people of color? There's a lot of stereotyping and bias here, although often many people don't recognize it. They say, I don't see it, it's fine. How do you begin to have a conversation that makes the shifts that we need to make in the state?
I think it depends on where you first start. So if I were to convene a group of friends and 12 of you showed up in my living room, we were going to talk about it, I'd begin it one way. If I were going to be working in a school where some things had bubbled and people were not happy, we would have to begin it a different way. So in those situations where things are already bubbling, one of the things we want to do is acknowledge that people's hearts are racing and their breathing is shallow and they're worried. And they're worried that the thing they're thinking is going to get washed aside and they won't get heard. So you have to let them know, as Lisa says, the design. Here's how we're going to talk about it. People have to see it coming. And if it's going to be different than the way hearings and so forth are usually done, or town meetings or something, we have to let them know every step, and they have to know, when am I going to have a chance to say something, or someone who's like me get a chance? Depends on the size of the group. One that I just recently did, we were able in a previous meeting to get things settled down. Some people that were coming were still worried about it and were pretty anxious. They thought we were going to be talking about what are we going to do in the school. And the first thing we asked was, when did you first learn about race? And so we didn't even want to know all of the things that people were saying, this is what scares me about it, or race is not an issue to me. I just wanted to know, how did you learn about it? And in that one circle around, in a group of 25 people listening to that, people went, oh, to folks who had a different experience, particularly people of other races.
Sure.
And that's a nice way. So you're talking to human beings, you're not just talking to a collection of ideas.
And to their personal experience.
Exactly.
And they're hearing other people, so that's terrific. Back to South Burlington for a second. How is South Burlington as a city changing the way it kind of does business? Or is it? I think, they still have public hearings, or you're an employee,
Yes.
right, of the city. So how have you changed how they communicate?
I don't think anything has changed yet. We are actually next week having another community conversation. There was one of the outcomes that came out of last year's was where people were really clear, like, we don't get to do this enough. We don't get to sit down with people we don't know and have a very real conversation. And so a big request for, let's do this more, let's keep doing this. And so we are doing it again next week on the 17th. And one of the conversations that has started, no change has happened yet, but to start to have conversations about what does it mean to be a restorative community, what does it mean to be a restorative city, and can we look at all the different ways that we do public communication, and are there opportunities to change those? Can city council meetings, can school board meetings run differently? Can they be structured and designed in a different way so they are more interactive? And just to start to have those conversations and see what is possible.
How would you define a restorative community? What does that mean?
And my definition is changing over time. I think of restorative as twofold. One is that there is a true sense of community and that people feel a sense of belonging within that community, like I personally matter and that there's something here to belong to. So there's a part of it that's proactive community and relationship building work. Then there's part of it where it's setting up structures and processes that foster that intentional relationship and community building, and that those are embedded throughout the community. Schools, like I said, the public meetings, the way nonprofit organizations work, the way employee reviews happen, the way regulation happens, there's a philosophy of relationship and community building embedded in how we do business. There's also a part of it that is when things go wrong, that the attention is to repair the relationships and the damage that was done so that the fabric of the community doesn't stay torn and it's repaired.
It's a place where you can always come back.
So it seems that crisis can certainly be an opportunity. It can be also missed, but how, Susan, can you move from crisis to opportunity and not miss that, even though everybody's riled up and on edge?
That may be part of the hardest piece. If you can kind of survive this thing that happens and you have this bit of understanding, you probably end up with a core group of people who want to keep talking. Other folks kind of fade away. Whoever's kind of running the show, the city council or whatever you have, go, thank goodness this is settled down. And then nothing else happens. So it's very difficult to get your foot in the door to say, now let's do a little planning for other things that might come up. How do you want to handle this? And that's the advantage of having community justice centers, is that they have recognition. I don't go roaming around to schools and communities and saying, hey, let me show you this. These folks they're an entity and they're known and they have a track record and they can approach and say, let's do a little more planning. Let's think about what happens when something gets difficult.
And to that, we talked about technology a little bit. Certainly social media is influencing and supporting divisiveness. Right now, it's a real problem. I would think hopefully there's also things about technology that can help support us bridging divides. Have things changed in South Burlington? Do you have examples of, how do you begin with that issue where people feel so free to be so ugly in a way?
I definitely think it added to the painfulness and the divisiveness of what happened last year by the online conversation. And people make assumptions about each other based on a very short post. I don't know how technology can help that. It's not. I know there are dialogue platforms that are technology-based that other people have experience and skill in, and I don't. I really like coming together in person, getting to know somebody in a deeper way, being in the room with them. It's just my preferred way.
Okay. Assumptions are tough, and so how do you have difficult conversations that kind of gets to the truth of things that might be scary, that don't cause harm, that even in let's go to our families. So we have a family, we have a really bad issue. Nobody's brought it up for years. There are assumptions that have been made for many years. How do you help a family or any of us begin those conversations? How do we break that closed barrier that we've had for many years, where people are afraid and where would you
So a
Where would you
couple-
begin?
Let me just flesh out the picture too. It's not only do you have the family, but now you got all the in-laws. And they've really gotten in on the act.
Indeed.
And sometimes it's multi-generational.
Yeah, sure.
And they're carrying the message of others. I think one of the ways that we enter conversations with them, if people say, well, we have to decide what to do with our grandparents' property, but now it's brought back all of those old things and we're now really tied up in this and we're having a very difficult time. One of the first things we'd be asking is, well, what's your hope out of this? How do you want to end up this in relationship to the other person? Sometimes people say, I don't want anything to do with them. I don't care. And we might poke at it a little bit and find out. We will say, okay, so you just want this decided and you want to be able to walk away. Sometimes they don't mean it, but that's theirs to figure out. Usually people will say, I'd like it to not be so bad. If you hear that, you're in business. I'd like it to not be so bad. What would it take for it not to be so bad? What's happening that you wish were different? How do you think you are contributing to it? And that's the magic question. How are you contributing to it? So you begin with those pieces, and with families, sometimes family stories help. So with the grandparents' house, because we've talked to the people that are getting ready to get together and whatever, we happen to know that they all got together as kids and they loved the place. So let's ask them to tell that story. So what is that, and what was it about that? Well, we got together with our cousins. How many of the cousins are in the room? Yeah, tell that. What was it like? Okay, good. So now for you, you can't afford to keep the house, but you can't stand to let it go, and that's what the dilemma is. There are no guarantees to this, and some of these end up with wonderful, heartwarming moments, and some of them don't. That people get to decide what they want to do about it, but all we can do is open that opportunity. And my guess is everybody listening to this conversation has experiences like that. They think, well, maybe it's time to talk with my sister about how she doesn't want to have anything to do with our other sister. And sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't.
And I was thinking, like, if I personally, within my family, there's an issue I wanted to start to wrestle with as a family, I would start with the people I have the closest relationships and just say, hey, I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking we might be at a place we can together tackle this. What do you think? And I'd start one-on-one conversations with the people I'm closest with and just, see what happens and if there's some momentum that builds. So I might take the risk to, like, step in.
Before we get to our audience, I have a few more questions, but I want to get to them soon. But how did you begin to pursue this line of work? What brought you to mediation? Susan?
I am a child of civil rights, and that teaches you a lot about what you better learn to do, or there's going to be just horrific problems. And I was really influenced by a person named Bill Lincoln. And Bill was one of the ministers who was taking young African-American children through crowds of screaming people and getting them into a school. And somebody else was driving the car. He was in the back seat with two children, sheltering them because the crowds were banging on the windows. And suddenly someone threw a brick through the front, and glass shattered everywhere, and it was all over him and all over the kids. And they drove in, and he said he remembers he let the kids out, and he goes, there has got to be a better way to do this. So I grew up thinking there's got to be a better way to do this, and that was just always kind of what I kept listening for and thinking for, of how do we engage it. So I got into it essentially through being an advocate and trying to help. Advocacy is not always just fighting, it's finding the best way to get something figured out. So that's where I got into it.
Thank you. Lisa?
For me, I was really wrestling with, I wanted to work with people, but the way I worked with them mattered to me. And I didn't want to be in a position of authority, and I didn't want to be kind of like in a helping position. I wanted to be in a position that really honored people's self-determination, honored their own wisdom about themselves and their lives, and had that at the center of how I worked with people. Yeah.
Have questions come up for anybody in the audience for these two mediators? I can keep going. Yes, in the back came up first. That's that. Yes, you. Yes, Martha. Thank you, Martha.
I have a question about when you're working with people of a different nationality and there's a disruption between, say, an Asian person. I had a problem with a woman who was Asian, and when she spoke to me in her English, I could not understand. You know, one of those brains that doesn't get languages? And I insulted her because she was embarrassed because she was trying to speak English and it didn't work. I feel so bad about this.
Oh.
And I'd like to be able to I'd like to be able to go back there and say, how can we work together? But I don't know,
The next step for
Yes.
that situation.
That really is one of the hardest situations, because if you can't understand, you can't understand. But you don't want to point that out or whatever. I think all you can do is be gracious and say, please bear with me. I don't always catch some things, say again.
And there's something about it acknowledging that it's not like some shared responsibility about the communication, so that people don't walk away thinking it's them, they're the problem. And language for all of us can involve a credible amount of humiliation. If you've ever tried to learn a new language that's not your first language, there's a risk to try and to start to speak. And so the more we can try to remove the shame and humiliation out of the equation, the better, by acknowledging our common struggle to learning a new language is hard. I mean, for some of us it's easier than others, and there's a risk there. And to just be real and open and human, and maybe actually ask for help to have another person who can help that communication go better.
I was wondering about that, to interpret
Yeah.
when I go back, I need to talk one-on-one with her.
Yeah, but for me, I would take some responsibility that, this is not all you, I am struggling. And so that it doesn't feel like it's all one person's fault.
Thank you, Shelburne.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
And Connor, you'll let me know if we can't hear the audience questions. I could repeat them. We're good?
We're good.
Okay, great. Yes, sir.
So I'm trying to drill down a little bit and understand exactly what you folks do as a mediator. And what I've heard is you get people with different points of view together in a room, and sometimes they kind of solve the problem on their own. I've also heard each of you say, well, you get in a corner with somebody from one side and you talk to that person and suggest that they say something or ask a question. And I have probably also have heard that in public with the opposing parties, you will ask questions for people to answer. So am I right in saying that all three of those are the devices, or is there one of them that's that's predominant. And I guess the follow-up question is, do you ever suggest the solution, or is it always trying to get the party involved to come up with a solution?
Take it away.
It's a little bit of a complicated answer because there's a set of tools that can be applied to different contexts. And there's a specific process that's called mediation that tends to get people together in conflict, which tends to be smaller groups. So when we go to larger group processes or dialogues, it doesn't tend to get called mediation, even though many of the same tools and skills are used in both contexts. So I'd say yes, that what you laid out, yes, all of that could be considered within the realm of mediation, while also acknowledging there's a very specific process that's called mediation when people are in conflict that's designed to see if people can reach agreement. I consider my role through all of those is helping the conversation go well, thinking ahead about how to set it up, guiding it as it unfolds in the room. And personally, I prefer never to suggest solutions because the people with the lived experience of whatever they're trying to figure out know way better what's going to work for them than I do.
Susan?
It's pretty fundamental that the prime directive is self-determination. And we're very careful, just like in Star Trek, not to mess up anything because it'll change the future or whatever. So we're very careful how we introduce anything into it, other than process. We make lots of process suggestions. But go back to the grandparents' house. You say, well, tell me what you have considered doing with this house. I noticed you didn't say renting it out in the summer might be an option.
You're talking to the whole group.
You're talking to a whole group. Could be talking to 2 people, you could be talking to 20. I noticed you didn't mention renting it out in the summer. Did that come up? Because I'm curious, did it or not? Not because I'm promoting that idea. So, yeah, I have thoughts of what I might do or things that float through the head. That's neither here nor there. It only helps me ask questions, not to suggest what they should do.
And you run a risk if you're like, oh, I have this great idea, and you put it on the table. It can feel incredibly insulting to people to like, what, you think we haven't thought of that? So you have to be careful there.
That's interesting. Actually, just to follow up with that, sometimes you might be hearing things and there's an obvious solution that they're all kind of coming to, but no one's come to on their own yet. Is there kind of a guiding process when you feel, wow, it feels like they're saying this, this could happen, and please everyone, how do we get people at the table to see that solution? Or do the alarm bells go on and you go, I shouldn't be a part of that at all?
So if we think of this as an ecology, whatever the group of people is, whether it's 2 or 200, and it's an ecology, and it's trying to find its way, what we can do is to say, I notice a hill here and a valley here. I notice that what you folks have been saying that might be in common is this. And I notice that there are 3 different sets of things you're talking about that are of major concern. We work with organizing the material, reflecting it back and saying, is this it? So we're working with the natural flow of the group, not trying to determine where the river flows. Okay, so we don't want to be messing with that. We're just there to support them in it. We have a whole box of tools that we can use at different times, which are meant not to get people to do something, but to invite them into thinking about something. Does that help? Okay.
So yes, there is, when people are at that point, you're noticing, there's mostly through questions to ask that help people put their own thinking out. Yeah.
And my assumption about this is, if you're throwing it out, they aren't going to buy it. It's got to be their idea, right? ultimately.
Yeah, it goes better.
Sarah, did you have something, and then we'll get there? Yeah, sorry.
My question is kind of around addressing conflict across cultures. And just the fact that, you know, in our world today, we have more people from different cultures who are living together, sharing spaces, sharing lives. You know, in Vermont, we have more new Americans maybe than we did a couple of decades ago. And different cultures, the way that they solve conflicts is usually different than the way we do in our Western culture. So when there are conflicts across these cultures, how do you find a way to honor the way that everyone kind of deals with conflict that's going to make people feel comfortable when they're coming together to have those conversations? You know, like some cultures and people are not comfortable with eye contact or with being in a close physical space when they're talking. So I just wonder how you figure that out.
Great question.
Some of the people I partner with are cultural brokers. So they are people in mostly new American communities who are leaders in their own communities. And I partner with them to be able to say, like, what do you think? How's this going to work? And sometimes they also can serve as interpreters, and sometimes both roles. So I always ask people, if I ask something that makes no sense within your cultural context, will you please let me know so that we can do this differently? And I really appreciate that help, because I won't know otherwise.
Just asking people, how do you handle this? What's comfortable, what's not comfortable? How do we manage it? And it's not just their conflict practices, it's what their history brings. I had a school ask me, I was doing some conflict work in a school, and they had a school population of children that were native Vermonters, some that had come across from Canada, migrant workers, African Americans, and Hispanic, and then a new population of Vietnamese. And they were getting a lot of problems because the kids didn't understand each other. So we were doing some things, and then they said, would you get the parents together? And this was a really economically struggling community too. And they said, would you get the parents together? And I said, tell me what your goal is. And they said, we want the parents to teach the kids to not fight. I said, no, I'm not doing that. Because some of those people are alive because they could fight. What I will do is invite them to look at a continuum of conflict responses so they can help teach their children. So fight is not the first thing they choose.
Yeah. Dan? Yeah.
How do you diffuse kind of pent-up raw emotion when facts and data don't support, and no matter what you say, they have this inherent belief that, one, they're right, and two, there's a fear that there's something's going to be taken away from them. And gun safety is a classic example today. So you're dealing with somebody that no matter how much, even if you say 70% of Americans go by some kind of gun safety, or it's crazy that you won't fly in an airplane when it's the safest way of traveling, and they just feel like, I don't get it, or something's going to be taken away from me. And that's more damaging than something could be given to me. So how do you deal with people that are just so obstinate when they have this emotion, and then their idea of winning an argument is just talking louder or intimidation?
I'll tell you that one of my experiences in our community, where we will see that from time to time, is that a larger group has a remarkable ability to absorb that. So that somebody gets up and you see that rush of raw emotion that's really out of proportion to all things. People might say things that are just really hurtful and harmful, and somehow people just leave that space it doesn't really create a kerfluffle. They go, well, you know, that's what's happening for that person, and they kind of move on. I have a lot of confidence that that can happen. It doesn't always happen. It can. But I will tell you, that's one of the hardest things to deal with when you have a lot of that going on in a group. And you better find a way to have a different kind of conversation, which is where the design is so important. You don't have a big meeting, have a microphone, and let people get up and have at it.
Yeah. And it totally depends on the context. When it's a smaller group or, and it's interpersonal, there's a way that emotion actually can be such incredible value to the conversation. And usually my perspective is people don't tend to get passionate or upset if they don't care. So it gives you something to work with because people care. So at the heart of conflict is a care or a concern. And that I find is way easier to work with than apathy. So by meeting people, and mostly the biggest thing people know when they're that upset is that they need to know, I get you, I hear you. It doesn't matter if you agree, that's actually not what they're looking for. What they need to know is, I can tell you're really upset, here's my understanding about why this is so important to you. And that helps people be like, okay, cool, somebody got me.
You're talking about in a group, let's take a family situation, a family dinner. And how many times have we gone to dinner to say, don't bring up, don't talk about this.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
People are gonna go ballistic.
Yeah.
So you end up avoiding the conversation.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, no, let's not avoid it. Let's get it out there. Let's
Yes,
talk about
as
it.
long as people are prepared to not argue, but then say, here's what I hear you saying, here's what I get's important to you, here's why you are so passionate about this, instead of saying, here's what I think.
And best not do it at the dinner table.
Yeah, maybe right after. But I agree with you, there can be some reasons to not avoid and purposely engage that conversation. And it can actually help build relationships when done well, and people do feel heard as a result.
So what I'm hearing out of this is to have a family member, and I'm assuming it's like you, who cares enough that you want to get it done, and to have somebody say, I don't want to be walking around this. Can we find a way to talk about it? That gesture is such a giving gesture. And people may be willing to do it, and they may not, but start where you can. One thing I will tell you is, because I do a lot of divorce mediation, and it's fairly typical, you'll see that one person will irrationally just go off and have a lot of things to say. And this fellow was, he really got angry, and he was saying things that I know he'll regret. And he was standing up and kind of yelling. And I said, well, would this be a good time to just take a little break and whatever? So I stood out in the hall with him, and he was looking a little sheepish. And I said, and what's happening? And these tears were dribbling down his face. And he said, I'm afraid of losing my kids. That we can deal with. Okay, well, let's have that conversation. And he did. He was able to get himself together to say, here's what I'm worried about. Doesn't always happen, but yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I just want to comment when Elizabeth?
Lisa?
Yes, Lisa said, conflict comes from caring. That's big letters for me. I like that because you often think conflict comes because they don't like me or whatever. And it's because they care. Their
Right.
heart hurts. Something hurts.
There's something really important to that person within that conflict.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And to be really clear, Lisa and I are not in the business of trying to have conflict not happen. We're in the business of trying to have it happen in a really productive way, and that's what I hear you saying. We want people to engage in the things they care about. So it doesn't just knock out. Can I read something, Fran?
Absolutely, we're coming near the end, and I just have one.
That's what I thought.
Go for it.
You know how communities really struggle with whether you have a prayer at town meeting or so forth. In our town, which is Danville, our friend Toby Ballavey, who was the town attorney, created a civil invocation, which is used a lot. And this is the tone that you want when you have a gathering. Welcome to the Danville Town Meeting. We have come together in civil assembly as a community in a tradition that is older than our state. We come together to make decisions about our community. As we deliberate, let us advocate for our positions, but not at the expense of others. Let us remember that there is an immense gap between saying I am right and saying I believe I am right, and that our neighbors with whom we disagree are good people with hopes and dreams as true and as high as ours. And let us always remember that in the end, caring for one another in this community is of far greater importance than any difference which we may have. I just think this is such a powerful statement, and it informs how we want to be with one another.
Okay, we could close there, but I have one more question where I want to go. I'm interested in how, and is this true, are communities or even law enforcement shifting a little bit how they're dealing with, I mean, you work in the South Burlington Police Department building. Is law enforcement also evolving in the way they look at conflict, about the way they use mediation, possibly instead of criminal punishment? I know you have volunteers in the community who work with restorative justice. Can you just speak a little bit to that shift, societal shift, potentially, that might be happening?
And I will say within the criminal justice world, Vermont is unique in that we have this ability to have a process to talk about crime with the people impacted and to do that outside of court. That's unusual. And there's a big range, even within Vermont, in terms of how law enforcement like that process or feel it's valuable. Locally, here and largely in Chittenden County, there is a huge amount of support, and both because the outcomes are good in terms of like people walk away from it with intrinsic motivation not to commit crimes again because they understand how they affected people, and it is significantly cheaper than going to court. So both of those create support. In terms of mediation, not every police department has the option to send conflict cases to a community justice center. Some do. And at the South Burlington Police Department, they're the cases where people are repeatedly calling, asking for help, but there's no crime, there's no laws been broken, and so the police don't have anything to offer. They are thrilled to be able to have somebody to send people to say, can you please help these people and work with them and see what you can figure out. So they really appreciate having something to offer.
Great, thank you.
And Fran, the other
yes.
piece of this is under the Obama administration, there was an initiative for 21st century policing. And, you know, we're in a different era, and some of it is sticking and some of it is not. But it was really geared towards seeing that police had a wider range of skills and knew when to apply and to have a better sense of what was actually happening with people. So like some of the exact same things that we've been talking about, police can deal with more effectively. So.
An example of that is in Chittenden County, they're in the process, actually 4 people have been hired who are mental health workers that will work with police departments. And so that's an example of like having more people, a wider skill set to be able to deal with incidents as they arrive.
Terrific. And so just to wrap it up, we've really, I kind of had, what can untrained people practice in our daily life? You've already given us many tips. Are there other best practices that we can fall back on when our family or us or even a group or at work we're in conflict, or any other last thoughts before we close the evening, Susan?
I just want to reiterate the one that Lisa said. When you feel like you're in a discussion that's kind of tense with someone else, the single biggest tool you can use is to say, I want to make sure I'm understanding you. Is this what you're saying? And to do that with no sneer or aside or whatever. Just, I really want to understand you. Do I have it correct? Okay, doke. So I have a different thought. May I share that with you? Whatever way seems right. And as it goes on, you do it repeatedly. It's not just a one-time thing. Am I hearing you correctly?
And
you.
the other thing I'd add to that is often I will take the risk to be the first one to be vulnerable, to say, I'm really struggling with this, and to put myself out there and see what happens.
Yeah.
And I think also the ability to say, I'm sorry. I realized I didn't do that well. I realized I was insensitive to it. I realized whatever it is. But if there's something you could have done better, acknowledge it. It just goes a huge long way. And it doesn't cost you anything.
I mean, you were mentioning before the ability to grant ourselves and each other do-overs.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to speak to the do-overs again real quick?
When I did a conversation on race recently, I asked people to imagine themselves, standing up at a very large crowd and speaking. And people go, oh, yeah. Say, what happens is you say things and you realize you didn't say it quite like you wanted. Like tonight, I'm going to go home and go, did I say that right? So you always think, or you kind of get on a roll and you realize you got to a place you didn't want to. I said, we're talking about race. That's going to happen. Will you be willing as a group to grant people do-overs? That the first time they say it, it may not come out like they wanted, and they get to take that off the table and make another try. Or if in the conversation somebody said, a little while ago you said such and such, and I didn't like that. That's helpful. What I meant to say, or what I wish I had said, was such and such. The first one's gone, the second one's there. Just to be willing to let people try again to say what they want and don't stick them with the first thing they said.
And to let them say the first thing.
Yeah.
Also, because a lot of people, I think, are afraid to say the first thing.
Yeah.
But
We're gonna stumble with this.
Yeah.
That's just it.
we are out of time. I know we could talk about this much longer. Thank you all so much for coming here and joining in this conversation. Thanks to Lisa Bedinger and to Susanne Terry. You are both remarkable, and we are blessed to have you in our community and in our state. I want to thank the wonderful collaboration of Women as It Happens from All Souls, Shelburne Museum, Shelburne Farms, and the Shelburne Library. Actually, Shelburne Library has switched, so we have a man in the group now, which is terrific. And also thanks for funding this year from the Vermont Humanities Council, and to RETN, who's been there taping these and offering them to the rest of the community who couldn't make it tonight for the last 6 years. Thank you all so much. I'm Fran Stoddard. Thanks a lot. Hope to see you next year.